Hi there, my name's Christian Minton, and I want to talk today about the relationship between Mormons and Native Americans and what that has to do with the continued struggle for whiteness that Mormons had. If you're not familiar with this idea of Mormons not being considered white and struggling for whiteness, I encourage you to read this book, Religion of a Different Color by W. Paul Reeve. He's a wonderful historian and he really goes into deep depth about this idea. But just on the whole, here you can see Elder Huckleberry in the middle there with all of his different daughters. And this was from a Life magazine article. And essentially, it's the daughters take after their mothers, right? And they're all different races, you can see there. And this comes from the idea of polygamy being one of the twin relics of barbarism. And so, this idea that polygamy makes Mormons less white is an idea we're not very familiar with, but that nonetheless was true. The relationship between Native Americans and Mormons really comes down to Brigham Young. Brigham Young, as you see here, he had relationships with Native American tribes as well as he was the focal point of the federal government. He was the face of Mormonism, the face of polygamy for a time. So their relationship with him was tenuous, and his relationship with Native Americans was very complex. I encourage you to do your own research, but it's not enough time in this video to really go into it more. But he had sent troops in the conflict between the United States and Mexico called the Mexican American War. But as of 1850s and 60s, he's very much on the outs as far as the federal government is concerned. One of the reasons, of course, being polygamy, but also the relationship with the Native Americans. In fact, in the book Mormon Rebellion, America's First Civil War, 1857 to 1858, by David Bigler and Will Bagley, they said that the Mormon relations with Native Americans were a significant factor in President Buchanan's decision to order U.S. Army troops to Utah, beginning a conflict that would later be called the Utah War. Brigham Young and other church leaders taught that by accepting baptism and intermarriage with Mormons, Native Americans will fulfill a book of Mormon prophecy that the Lamanites would return to the house of Israel. And of course, that this idea of interracial marriage in the United States at this time was very much not accepted in the way that it is today. And this idea of Native Americans being of a separate kind also is seen in these kind of letters. So as you can see, that letter, what essentially it says is that this land that is out west needs to be used properly. It needs to be farmed, and that Native Americans, of course, are not farming it and not using the land properly. And this idea of improper land use is another one of these factors in why my idea of how Mormons were able to convince others that they were white. Also, a little bit of a backstory here about why I think the 1865 treaty is important. Utah has a shaky relationship with the federal government through the late 1850s and early 1860s. There was both the Utah Rebellion or the Utah War, and also there was 1862 laws against polygamy. And so the federal government is really going after Utah at this time. But in 1865, they decide to unify for a single cause, which I think is very commentable. Commentatable. But essentially, it comes down to the relationship with Native Americans. So there had been previous attempts to get Native Americans onto specific reservations. The first being the Spanish Fork Indian Farm Reservation. Now, this was very small, this was small scale. They were attempting to teach Native American peoples how to farm land. But of course, Spanish Fork now is full, we know. It's very profitable land, it's very useful land. And the usefulness of the land is a hinge point there. So The Utah Mormons consider Utah Valley and its surrounding areas very farmable land, valuable land, and so does the federal government. And they both have a need and a desire to separate Native Americans from the land that they consider them not using properly. And so while the federal government and Mormons had not had the best relationship before, they decided to unite on a single issue here. So the federal government sends a man named O.H. Irish. And O.H. Irish would go on to have a very important career being, a diplomat to foreign countries, to being part of different agencies within the federal government later in his career. But he is sent out to Utah to essentially create a reservation system, to create a treaty with Native Americans in 1865. Now, 1864 had been one of the worst winters on record up to that point. Native Americans were starving. And before he arrives, he sends this letter to Brigham Young. Now, essentially, he's saying that he intends to get natives off all the agricultural land and move them into the Uinta Reservation, which is what Brigham Young wants. He also wants to work with Brigham Young in an unofficial capacity, and I quote, unofficial capacity. It also has a reference to an extreme financial situation that the federal government is in because of the Civil War, which would also be a problem for the reservation later. It also has several sections devoted to good treatment of Native Americans, which is a prime example of the dichotomy of opinion that is very evident and extent at this time, where they have good intentions and good values and everything like that, but then later on, because of either problems of money in the Civil War or flat out racism, they don't follow through on certain things. But I think it's very interesting that he says he wants to work with Brigham Young in an unofficial capacity. And this actually works out so well for both parties that the aristocrats, if you will, of Salt Lake City actually all write to the federal government to make O.H. Irish the governor of Utah, or this territory of Utah at the time. The idea and the treaty were actually well received from politically oriented newspapers, mind you, but would not actually be ratified by Congress because of its association with Brigham Young. Here you can see the reservations here of the United States, and of course how much of those reservations is owned by the state in orange. But in the northeastern corner of Utah, that large orange plot, this is the reservation in question. Of course, the natives would not take kindly to this, and there would be another war that would be known as the Black Hawk War. Of course, not the first Native American based relationship war. We, of course, had our Wakara's War, and then their Black Hawk War. And these would resonate throughout Utah's history. I think that this is truly a turning point where the federal government and the Mormon so-called government of Utah were aligned. They were not at each other's throat in the same way. They had similar goals. And this, I think, aided in Mormonism's struggle for whiteness. Of course, now we think of Mormonism as a supreme example of whiteness, even perhaps white supremacy in some instances, as this book here discusses. But we have to remember the history of the religion itself. It started in a place not dissimilar from other types of individuals who weren't considered white, who are now considered white. And in my personal opinion, and I hope this video has discussed it enough that you too consider that perhaps one of the factors in Mormonism's transition to whitehood would be their relationship with Native Americans, and how those goals that they had aligned with the federal government in certain instances, even though they had a sort of rocky history with the federal government. But thank you so much for listening today, and I hope you have a great one.